Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has toured the northeastern Sumy region of Ukraine, which borders Russia. It's his first visit to the area since Ukraine launched its assault into Russia's Kursk region. Zelenskyy met with Ukrainian commanders and said that Ukraine has no plans to occupy the area long term, but he wants to create a buffer zone to prevent Russia from launching more airstrikes into Ukraine. Now, it's important to note here Zelenskyy did not cross the border into Ukrainian-occupied Russian territory. DW correspondent Nick Connolly, he has been embedded with Ukrainian troops during their operations in the Kursk region. He accompanied them as they headed for the town of Sudzha, just beyond the border with Russia, where Ukraine is setting up a military command office. DW's Nick Connolly joins us from the Ukrainian side of the border. Nick, good to see you. You have just returned from the Russian side. Tell me, what is the situation there? What did you see?
Well, obviously, it is very unfamiliar, right? You're seeing these same scenes that we've seen now for 2.5 years in Ukraine, in the south and in the east. You have those abandoned streets, a few old people trying to somehow survive against the backdrop of artillery fire in the distance, except this time it's in Russia. Has to be said, though, compared to some of the places you might have heard of in the east of Ukraine, around Avdiivka, Chasiv Yar more recently, the fighting, or at least the artillery fire, is not very intensive. You don't hear it that often. It does come routinely, but it's not a kind of constant backdrop. But what makes the situation there particularly kind of unusual, and what made the Ukrainian soldiers we were there pretty nervous, was quite how unclear the front lines still are, right? So we know that the Ukrainians have about 30 kilometers they've kind of moved inside the country, inside the Russian kind of territory, but there still are groups of Russian soldiers seemingly operating behind Ukrainian lines, so it's all pretty flexible and pretty unclear and potentially dangerous. We were on an embed, so we weren't fully free to move around as we might have wanted. That's basically the only way to get there. Let's have a look at what we brought back from Sudzha yesterday. The windows of a Ukrainian armoured personnel carrier grant only a limited view. Empty streets and the occasional sound of shelling in the distance. You could be somewhere along the front lines in Ukraine, but this is Russia, under Ukrainian control. We're on an embedded trip, which means that we will have Ukrainian army personnel with us throughout. We're not able to go in with our own vehicle and move freely, but for now that is pretty much the only way to get in and to get some idea of what's going on there, even if we only see part of the story. No one knows how many Russian civilians were left behind when Ukrainian forces crossed the border. Locals told us the town's Russian authorities simply got in their cars and fled. Those remaining have had no running water, no power, and crucially, no phone signal for 2 weeks now. Cut off from news and their families in the rest of Russia. Compared to many places in eastern Ukraine, it seems comparatively quiet, but the Ukrainian soldiers accompanying us are on edge. We were just trying to talk to some locals here in Sudzha, and there was a big shout from all the Ukrainian troops with us. They have seen a Russian Zala drone up in the sky above, which would normally get coordinates for artillery or other strikes that could potentially be coming this way. Oleksiy Dmitrishkivsky is the spokesperson for the newly created Ukrainian military command in Kursk region. He says he never expected to be here. Unlike Russia, he says, Ukraine has no plans to annex territory.
We don't want to keep this land. We don't need it. We've had to do this to show our enemy that they're vulnerable as well, that they're not all-powerful.
Ukraine's leaders want the world and ordinary Russians to see images like this. They want ordinary Russians to put pressure on Vladimir Putin to move troops away from the front lines in the east of Ukraine to defend Russian soil here in Kursk. For now, it seems that they're not doing that. They're not moving large numbers of troops away from Donbass. But the hope among the Ukrainian troops here is the longer this goes on and the more Russian territory they take, that eventually Russia will be forced to draw down its troops in Ukraine. We're going to see some of the locals who are hiding in a cellar nearby. The streets are empty. Basically all you can hear are generators in the distance. There's still no power here, and very occasionally some Ukrainian military transport. It's mainly the elderly and those looking after sick friends and relatives who stayed behind. The people we meet stay close to the basement where they sleep for safety.
No one offered me a chance to evacuate. People got out on their own, in their cars. I live alone. My daughter lives far away. I had no way of getting out. I was looking after an elderly friend. She was sick before. I couldn't just leave her. She died yesterday, and we buried her today.
Many have been left homeless by the continuing artillery fire between Ukrainian forces here in Sudzha and Russian forces nearby.
My house was bombed. There's only a crater left. I was here when it happened yesterday. The house is destroyed.
There's talk of setting up humanitarian corridors to allow these people to reach areas under Russian government control. But so far, it's no more than talk.
I came to work in Sudzha that day. We didn't understand what was happening. I've been here ever since. My parents are back in the village. They're 84 and 83 years old. I don't know what's happened to them, and they don't know what's happened to me.
Then, something we weren't expecting to see. The Ukrainian army spokesperson gets out his laptop to show these Russian civilians video from Bucha, the town near Kiev, where Russian troops are accused of carrying out war crimes when they controlled the area. The locals seem exhausted, barely able to take anything in. It's a moment that reveals more about how Ukrainian soldiers on Russian soil are feeling than it does about Russians' views on the war. Some Ukrainian soldiers seem to think that if they can show ordinary Russians what was done in their name in Ukraine, then perhaps those Russians will question Vladimir Putin's story of what he calls the special military operation in Ukraine. We don't have time to see any more. We're told it's time to leave.
Nick, that's an excellent report there. Fascinating insight on the other side of the battle line. And it seems that the Ukrainian troops in Russia were almost as surprised by the speed of this operation as everyone else.
I think that's true, and we're increasingly learning from reports, some anonymous, some more directly attributed, that the Ukrainians have tried to cross the border in other parts of Russia, in Bryansk and in Belgorod, so west and east respectively of where I am here in Sumy on the border with Kursk region, and that didn't work out. They might have got in a few kilometers and then been pushed back. So the fact that this worked out and that it proved so possible to get that far in a short space of time. This has only been going on basically now for 2 weeks, and we've got reports of Ukrainian troops up to 40, 50 kilometers deep into Russian territory in some parts. And not only the territory that they are controlling, it's also about prisoners of war. We've had Ukrainian soldiers tell us that they have captured more Russian soldiers over the past 2 weeks than in the previous 2.5 years of the war. And these are all people that can be exchanged for Ukrainians held in Russia. Russia has been very reluctant to give more kind of elite Ukrainian units and all the kind of more experienced Ukrainian troops who are in Mariupol, for instance, or connected to the Azov regiment. They have kept those back. And now the hope here in Ukraine is that in return for these Russian prisoners of war, some of these people will come home. So that is a kind of, the internal Ukrainian story about Ukrainian soldiers who've been in Russian captivity potentially coming home sooner than people would have expected.
You mentioned Bucha in your report, one of the places Russians carried out atrocities in Ukraine. Is there a sense among Ukrainian troops that they must do all they can to avoid harm to Russian civilians? Are they cognizant of the watchful eye of the world?
I think that is something that is very clear to the Ukrainian commanders in Kursk. That's certainly something that they are paying attention to. Seemingly, people excited about this operation just driving behind me there. We have seen lots of Ukrainian social media reports, videos of Ukrainian soldiers handing out humanitarian aid, bringing in doctors to treat the elderly people there in Sudzha. Some of this obviously is about the kind of PR battle, but I think something you hear from the Ukrainian soldiers off camera is they will tell you, we have nothing against Russians in Russia. That is their land. We're not trying to take it. We have something against Russians in Ukraine and against Vladimir Putin. And they are very conscious of the fact that if they treat the prisoners of war well, if they treat civilians well in Sudzha, that will also help to demotivate Russians from fighting in Vladimir Putin's army. So the hope is by showing that Ukraine is not there to annex bits of Russia, that they can prevent ordinary Russians from signing up to fight in Ukraine.
And Nick, before we let you go, you are back in Ukraine tonight. There are reports that say that Russia is to issue international arrest warrants for journalists who enter occupied territory. That is a risk. How is that affecting your work, if at all?
look, we're not able to report from Russia or from the Russian-occupied bits of Ukraine. We don't have accreditations. They are not interested in giving us that access. So for us, immediately, not a lot changes. I think it looks like more journalists will be going to Sudzha, to Kursk with these kind of embedded trips. So presumably there'll be more of these cases going. I think interesting thing to kind of point out about this is that according to Russian law, all the places in eastern Ukraine we've been reporting on for 2 years, in Kramatorsk, Pokrovsk or Kherson in the south, that is all according to Russian law, also Russia. But seemingly they don't need to open criminal cases for people accessing those areas. They still make a difference between Kursk, internationally recognized Russian territory, and the bits of Ukraine that Russia has annexed. I think for now it doesn't mean a great deal, but certainly it is an attempt to dissuade people from going, from scaring people. For now it doesn't seem like it's working.
Well, Nick, we certainly do appreciate your excellent reporting, and we appreciate that you are in safety tonight back in Ukraine. Nick Connolly. Nick, thank you. I'm joined now by Robert Murrett. He's a military and defense analyst with the Institute for Security Policy and Law at Syracuse University. He served as a vice admiral in the U.S. Navy. Mr. Murrett, it's good to have you with us. You know, Ukraine's president says that he wants to have Kursk as a buffer zone. How's he going to do that?
Yeah, Brian, great question. I think that it's kind of emerged as more than a buffer zone than really a front line in the fighting that we've had so far. I think much to the surprise of both sides, both the Russian forces have been involved and also the Ukrainians when they started the offensive, and they've been able to take more territory and certainly capture a lot more Russian soldiers, prisoners than they ever expected.
How do you explain Russia's reaction so far? I mean, why is Russia not pulling up troops from the Donbass in eastern Ukraine to defend Russian territory?
Yeah, Brent, as you say, I think that has surprised everybody. The Russian response has been pretty underwhelming. And just from a purely military standpoint, the clear evidence of lack of what we call unity of command, which is one of the overriding principles that all of us have in any kind of military operations, air, ground, or sea. And it's become pretty much apparent that they don't have unity of command in terms of the operations they're trying to conduct, the Russian forces in Kursk, whereas the Ukrainians do have unity of command. And the other thing is the types of troops they've tried to counter. As you know, this gets into one of the vulnerabilities that Russia has in terms of not using conscripts inside Ukraine, using them inside Russian territory. And those are not nearly as well trained or motivated as the Ukrainian troops that they're up against.
Ukraine's advance in the Kursk region, I'm sure it has to tie up a lot of resources. When does the law of diminishing returns begin to set in for Ukraine's military?
That's a great question, Brent. I think that's what everybody wonders right now. The Ukrainian forces have actually done this pretty efficiently, but there's no question that one of the key issues is the trade space on both sides between Russian and Ukrainian forces that are tied down in the operations in Kursk, as opposed to the all-important continued offensives that Russia is doing in Donbass there in eastern Ukraine, and any evidence that they're having to pull forces out of there to counter what the Ukrainians have been successful in doing, and Kursk and really overlapping into two of the adjoining provinces.
I want to get your take on what we've been seeing coming from the Ukrainian military. It's now being very open about which U.S. weapons, which U.S. weapons systems that it's using to hit Russian targets on Russian territory. And is that wise in your opinion? Because, I mean, you're in the United States. You're there where there could be some major political blowback, possibly.
I think it's very much a coalition effort. I've seen a lot of equipment that has been used in this operation from the United Kingdom, from France, from your own country, from Germany. And I think the United States arms are a significant part of their efforts, but nonetheless, I think it's very much the NATO partners that continue to support the Ukrainians. I think that'll continue for the foreseeable future. And in fact, another point I would make, Brent, just in closing, is that there hasn't been much pushback from the Western allies of Ukraine at all. In fact, our own Defense Department made a statement a couple of days ago saying that this was consistent with what the Ukrainians need to do to change conditions on the battlefield and kind of change the balance that we've got in the region.
Robert Murrett, it's always good to talk with you. We appreciate you taking the time to share your valuable analysis tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.